Welcome, everyone, to the Real World Perspectives on Poverty Solutions speaker series. It's great to have you here at the School of Social Work for this presentation sponsored by Poverty Solutions and the Ford School of Public Policy. And I'd like to also welcome our audience on YouTube. It's also great to have you here. We are really excited to have Dr. Nyron Crawford with us today. He's a political scientist, evaluator, facilitator, and outdoor educator. He currently serves on the faculty at Temple University, where he's assistant professor of political science and a faculty fellow in the public policy lab. His research, teaching, and practice engages psychological science to explore law and policy, especially as they relate to politics and racialized public problems. And his talk for us today will show that expertise in relationship to marijuana legalization. His writing has been published in the Journal of Urban Affairs, Perspectives on Politics, Urban Affairs Review, Public Integrity, Political Magazine, and the Washington Post. Professor Crawford received his doctorate in political science from The Ohio State University. We are glad to have him with us in a week when our other major rival is attracting most of our attention. He is also an alumnus of the Faculty Leaders Program in Policy Research and Analysis at the Pardee Rand Graduate School and the Leaders in Equitable Evaluation and Diversity Program with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nyron Crawford to talk to us today. Let's welcome Dr. Crawford.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good, good. Thank you, Trevor, so much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here, and I'm happy to see all of you here as well. I am a bit nervous for a lot of different reasons. The first being that this is the first plane ride I've taken in the COVID era, and the first talk that I've given in person, so I'm a little out of practice. And the second reason is that I am a Buckeye, and we are in November, so I'll leave it at that. But I did come bring peace offerings of a pocket constitution, which are being distributed to you here today. Today, I'm going to talk about some new work that I've been engaging around recreational marijuana legalization, as well as criminal record clearance expungement. And so today's talk is titled Lost Boys, Invisible Men, Policy Feedback After Marijuana Reform. Now, when we talk about certain socioeconomic outcomes in the United States, we talk a lot about racial gaps, the differences between whites and blacks. And what I'm most interested in facilitating in my work is thinking about the policy tools that help us close those gaps, right? Thinking more systematically about the instruments that can be brought to bear to help facilitate greater racial equity. Thurgood Marshall has this note: mere access to the courthouse doors does not by itself assure proper functioning of the adversary process. And that is to say that simply having policies and programs available does not mean that they're going to provide the kind of relief that we're hoping that they might. And so I've been thinking a lot about this idea of race equity, which is a term of phrase that has been used quite a bit and has been adopted at almost every level of government currently. And unlike other terms related to it, I think equity is the most useful in helping us remember that not everyone experiences the administrative state the same. And that if we want policy success, which presumably we do if we're in that enterprise, then we have to think more seriously about how problems are defined and the solutions that we bring to help achieve them. So today, I'm going to think about race equity in the context of marijuana legalization, as well as criminal record expungement. And so I'm going to engage in a bit of a critical policy analysis. This is a little different, unlike other research talks where we're having a lot of conversations about data and research designs. And I'm going to start with two fundamental points. The first is that too few of those harmed by cannabis prohibition are currently benefiting from recreational marijuana legalization. This is coupled with an additional challenge that we know very little about those individuals other than they experience the criminal legal system. There's too little policy research and analysis that has focused on the attitudes and behaviors of African Americans specifically who are disproportionately burdened by marijuana prohibition regarding reform, right? So we know very little about how they've thought about whether they supported the ways that they're engaging in it. And that creates a blind side for how we think about developing further problems to relieve some of the concerns that we have related to marijuana prohibition. And I want to offer a disclaimer that I have more questions than answers or data. And so really thinking through this together and using marijuana as a bit of a case study. And my topic, or at least my subject of interest here, are African Americans, because as I noted, they are disproportionately caught up in the dragnet of marijuana prohibition. So this talk is mostly conceptual as I thread through this critical analysis. So here, Mark Maurer, who used to run the sentencing project, the dramatic rates at which African American males have come under some form of criminal justice supervision has created a complex set of problems. In thinking about this work together, I have a specific racially equitable outcome that I desire, and that is to eliminate racial disparities and collateral consequences of a criminal record, and generally to eliminate collateral consequences entirely. Now, if you don't know, a collateral consequence is the extrajudicial punishment that a person that has a criminal record experiences far beyond the penalties imposed by the state. So if you're arrested, you spend time in jail, you're incarcerated, you get out, you still have that criminal record, and that criminal record can be prohibitive in terms of you getting employment, getting access to Pell Grants, getting access to licensures. And so inevitably what ends up happening is that individuals who have criminal records continue to suffer from previous acts that have already been dealt with through the punitive regimes of the state. We also know that the punitive nature of these collateral consequences are related to race. For example, states that have greater share of African Americans have more punitive or higher scores as it relates to collateral consequences. So race is related to laws restricting the rights and privileges of people who have had contact with the criminal legal system, particularly those with conviction records in American states. Now, why does that matter? Where does it show up? Collateral consequences are everywhere. We can see them in occupational and professional licensing, business licensing and hiring or retention, and that includes licensures for dispensaries of marijuana. We see collateral consequences across industries, most prominent in the healthcare industry, public employment, education and schools. We also know that decision makers have a great deal of discretion in applying these consequences to individuals who have a criminal record. So more than half of the decision makers are able to exercise their own discretion in determining whether or not a criminal record is reason to exclude someone from a particular opportunity. And there is no end date necessarily for how long those collateral consequences are tethered to an individual with a criminal record. There are a number of offenses related to collateral consequences. Felonies are the most common. Any crime, controlled substances crimes account for about 16%. And again, also that includes marijuana as well. Now, fortunately, we have a policy instrument that can help us deal with these collateral consequences. Now, policy instruments are those policy techniques or mechanisms to directly or indirectly affect the behavior of those involved. So these justice-involved individuals, people with criminal records. And that policy instrument are expungements. Expungements are a policy tool that allows individuals who have these records that are public and available to employers or others who do a criminal background check, and to render some of these records invisible to these individuals so that it's not used against them in determining their eligibility for a particular opportunity. Right? So expungements allow us to seal or at least restrict who has access to the kind of criminal histories of a person. Right? So we have this instrument that can help us deal with these collateral consequences. Now, one of the reasons that expungement is an important policy instrument is that we know that having an expungement is associated with boosts in employment. So we've already said that having a criminal record can reduce your opportunities for gainful employment. We know that by expunging one's record, they have greater access to employment and higher wages. It also helps reduce recidivism among individuals with prior offenses. So from what we know so far, it has some positive effects. Now, there's some debate I will offer about how sealed these records actually are in the age of the internet. Sometimes it's very easy to still find that someone has a criminal record or has been arrested. If you are familiar with newspapers that actually publish mugshots, for example, it's very hard to scrub that off. But nonetheless, this policy instrument is provided by governments to provide relief to these individuals, relief specifically from collateral consequences. In order to have that benefit, individuals with prior carceral contact actually have to take up the program. In most places, expungements can only be gained through petition. That means that if you are someone who has a record, you have to petition the state, sometimes the county, sometimes a prosecutor, in order to get this particular relief. And I'm going to talk about this a little later. But what this petition-based expungement does is it creates a great deal of administrative burden for individuals who are probably already having misgivings about engaging with the state, right? So thinking about going back to the dog that bit you in the first place, right? And so take up is an essential element or a building block to eliminate these collateral consequences. But there's a problem. Specifically, we know that take up of criminal record expungement is actually quite low. It's about 6.5% in the state of Michigan, according to a law review by one of the faculty members here at Michigan. And so this creates a problem that we have to define a little more specifically, which is too few eligible record bearers take up criminal record expungement. So those who are eligible simply are not petitioning or participating or taking advantage of this opportunity to seek out relief from these collateral consequences. And this creates what Chien calls a second chance gap, the difference between eligibility and the delivery of second chance relief. Now, what does this have to do with marijuana legalization? It turns out that marijuana legalization now occupies a legitimate policy position in the United States. 38 states have reversed their prohibitions and provided allowance for recreational medicinal use. And it turns out there's a great deal of overlap between the two issues, what we refer to as interdependence, right? This policy problem in one area frequently affects policy problems in another area. Specifically, the individuals who are eligible for record clearance, there's a great deal of overlap with those who are arrested or convicted of a marijuana-related crime. So they really got me thinking about, again, thinking about policy tools, thinking about race equity, and how do we bring these tools to bear to provide relief to individuals that continue to experience punishment from the state. We know that marijuana prohibition led to disproportionate police contact among African-American men, even though use among men and women is about equal for Black and white Americans. Now, this is not a talk about the drug war. That area is well tilled, but you understand that contact is disproportionately racialized, and that African-Americans are more likely to be penalized at almost every level or every touch point in the criminal legal system. And so it makes sense in some regard to say that if we lift prohibitions on marijuana, this would provide relief from the problems of this disparate contact, right? That simply allowing for marijuana possession would deal with the decades of divestment, disconnection, and disorganization brought on African-American communities by simply saying that police officers will no longer enforce marijuana prohibition, right? And so here at Levy-Pound says, in the face of discriminatory patterns and practices of harassment and humiliating searches, it is understandable why the simplest approach may appear to be legalization of marijuana in hopes of reducing the unnecessary arrests or harassment of young Black men. And indeed, we see this to be somewhat true. This is data from a study that I conducted with a colleague, Chris Towler, and the Black Voter Project, and where we're trying to explain support for marijuana legalization. And we conducted a survey of African Americans, about 1,200 African Americans, and asked them a variety of questions. The one thing that I should note is that when I talk about race equity and African Americans' attitudes and behaviors, we don't know a great deal about this particular community as it relates to these particular problems, right? We've not asked them. There's not a lot of public opinion data for them specifically. But what we asked, when we tried to explain variation and support for legalization, a few things stand out. Individuals who have had an arrest, they've had carceral contact, are more likely to say they support legalization, right? That's consistent. Individuals who are stopped by in a traffic stop, they're pulled over by police, are also more likely. We see that at the top line. They have a greater likelihood on supporting legalization. The same is true for those who have experienced a Terry stop or stop and frisk, right? So individuals who have had direct contact with police are more likely to say they support legalization. Now, marijuana legalization actually ends up being a very good case study for some positive outcomes as it relates to disproportionality, as well as a case studies for what can go wrong when we don't take greater account for race, right? The first opportunity for marijuana legalization is pretty clear. There's been a liberalizing effect in the United States in support for marijuana legalization. More Americans, about 60%, say they support recreational use. This is data from YouGov. Do you think that the use of marijuana should be made legal in the US? 60% of American adults say yes. And when we look at the partisan difference, we have partisan polarization in almost all things else. That data does not suggest that. So even Republicans who were once adamantly against marijuana legalization are now on board. So much so that Republican senators in Colorado, which is a legalized state, were quick to try to scuttle the Trump administration's efforts. Attorney General Sessions was interested in kind of cracking down on states that had allowed for marijuana. And these Republican senators said, no, you can't do that. John Boehner, former Speaker of the House, is also now a consultant and board member in the marijuana legalization, also someone who was adamantly against it. So marijuana legalization presents an opportunity to think seriously about race equity. Also, majority of Americans also support criminal record expungement for those who were arrested or convicted of a marijuana or cannabis-related offense. 57% said they would support it. Again, a plurality of Republicans the same, right? So again, there's an opportunity. As well, many Americans also see that states that have legalized have been pretty successful. So far from the reefer madness that many people were concerned about, a good number of Americans across these categories seem to think that there's some success in legalization. Now, let me be clear. There also been, we've also seen that as legalization has happened, a good number of states have also taken up criminal record expungement. Now, this is a bit generous. Only 7 states actually allow specific cannabis-related expungements, but a greater number allow for broader categories that could include expungement of marijuana offenses as well. But there have also been a great deal of failure related to cannabis legalization. Here are some headlines that I pulled from some papers. The first top left, New Jersey, when they legalized, I think last year, it was said, or they were accused of not issuing any licenses to anyone, any African Americans. The social equity provisions that were well regarded in Illinois have largely failed and are caught up in court cases. The industry, the legal cannabis industry, which was many people advocated for under the premise that it would provide, again, racial equity, is largely, African Americans are largely absent from the industry. So there are a great deal of white entrepreneurs who are making billions of dollars from this industry that has been, where prohibitions have critically changed the lives of African Americans. Race equity is elusive in the legal weed business. And legal marijuana made big promises on racial equity and fell short. Now, that's just the commercial side of it, right? And by and large, most of the conversation about recreational marijuana has been focused on the commerce aspect of it. But there's an additional problem as well, which is that in some places, disparities in arrest have continued to persist. Like Colorado, we see racial disparities continue, Virginia, and elsewhere. Now, arrests in general have declined related to marijuana, but again, these racial disparities persist, and it raises a lot of different questions about what benefits actually accrue to individuals affected by these prohibitions. Specifically, despite the trend toward expungement, for example, there's a large proportion of Americans who still do not have, still have a criminal record related to cannabis possession. Now, this has been recognized by Congress, the House of Representatives passed the MORE Act, HR 3617, not too long ago. And in the findings of the act, these are the first two clauses. Communities that have been the most harmed by cannabis prohibition are benefiting the least from the legal marijuana marketplace. And a legacy of racial and ethnic injustices compounded by the disproportionate collateral consequences of 80 years of cannabis prohibition enforcement now limits participation in the industry. Now, I want to pose a question to you. Do you think that represents a policy failure? It's Friday, but we're in class. Raise your hand if you think it represents a policy failure. Okay. Is anyone willing to tell me why they think so? Any part of it?
Yeah, I think every part represents a policy failure, but it's, for different reasons. I would say as far as like expungements and not having representation in, as far as who's getting hired and formerly incarcerated people being able to find employment, I would say expungement is important, but the truth is that I worked at a dispensary for 2 years. I was a manager. We hire returning citizens. The city incentivizes us to hire returning citizens. We get more social equity points for that. If you're an equity applicant, if we're Black, I got uncles and brothers that was incarcerated. You know what I'm saying? So it's not really a thing for us. We want to hire returning citizens, expungement or not. The state, you have to submit a background check for every employee regardless. So every employee that works there has to have a background check. Sure. It's really hard to hide the fact that you've been incarcerated. A lot of people wear it on their sleeve, so it's not so much whether, it was an expungement or not. It's about how your employer feels about it, so that's why in Detroit, they're trying to create more social equity. They're trying to empower more people to, like me, to become the owners of these dispensaries, or even just people that understand equity and want to hire these people versus, trying to hide their past or things like that. We want to embrace those things. So I think you have to address that part. Who's making these decisions about hiring, Yep. And if you incentivize that, I think you can hire a lot more returning citizens and create those opportunities. As far as like the lack of representation, ownership, kind of hand in hand with the same thing. The biggest barrier to entry is financial. We don't have the startup cost to do it. So that's another thing that the ordinance in the city is doing. And maybe we can talk more about that, but partnering non-equity applicants with equity applicants, incentivizing them to develop partnerships with them, give them the tools they need to run successful businesses and become owners. By doing that, you create more equity applicants of color, and then those owners of color will, they'll want to hire these returning citizens who are in their community.
So you bring up several good points, right? And it's kind of scaffolded. And the first, you talked about the incentive structure, right? And so individuals are actually getting benefits from doing that, and which raises a different set of questions about ownership, right? And so I'll do this because it makes my application for the license look more beneficial, right? And when we look at data or some work related to social equity provisions and applications, we actually see that those tend to be less regarded. but yet there is this incentive, right? Whether it's perverse or not, we can think about it. But there are a number of issues that create entry problems, right? But there are also ways to think that maybe this is not a policy failure, right? And when we think about the way that vice has been legalized in the United States, whether it's gambling or whatever, there is a pattern that it tends to follow, which may suggest that actually it's pretty consistent and may, in fact, be a successful policy on those terms, right? And so there are three ways that people have thought about this. Vice is more likely to be legalized if individuals with high social status and who live conventional lifestyles normalize behavior that is otherwise frowned upon. You can think about Elon Musk smoking while he's on the podcast. Anyone ever watched the show Weeds? Okay. Anyone ever watched the show High Maintenance? Very good show on HBO. But both here in this context are normalizing the face of weed as white, when it has historically been black and penalized for that racialization. The second, people are more likely to support vice, in this case marijuana legalization, if that vice can produce revenue for the government. And third, where vice markets are emergent, business owners trading in vice can be vetted and excluded for transgressing the border or morality politics. So to your point, there may be some goodwill among entrepreneurs who want to hire returning citizens, but many of them are not obligated to do that and are not concerned about doing it. And if they do, they have the incentive, right? I want to seize on the second point for a moment. And what I'm trying to get at here is one of the things that became very clear in the legalization movement is that racial justice became one of the banners that was used to facilitate legalization. And when legalization happened, concerns about racial equity or racial justice largely disappeared, right? Does anyone know how much legal cannabis made in 2020? Anyone want to take a guess? I can't grade you, so you can guess without penalty. Throw out a number. Overall. 50 million? Okay. You got 50 million, 50 million, 50 million. Anyone else? 2 billion? Okay. Even add a little animation there. Someone know what that number is? 20 billion. I had to Google to make sure the number of zeros were correct. That's $20 billion. Colorado made $1 billion in its first year of legalization. It's projected to make $45 billion by 2025, right? And so there's a great incentive for states to legalize. It has nothing to do with people who've been adversely affected by the prohibitions. And so in one of my first efforts at this work, I talked about the importance of interest convergence. There's a lot of talk about critical race theory, so I hope we don't get in trouble. But this idea that nothing really happens for African Americans unless there's an abiding interest for whites to do that, to pass that particular policy. And when we look at the positive tax revenue for marijuana legalization, the interest of at least the white-dominated society becomes somewhat clear. And one of the things that I argue in this piece is that what has happened, at least in the legalization movement, in my view, is that many people assume that simply allowing people to have possession of marijuana was the interest of African Americans, nothing else. And so it raises a power imbalance, right, about whose interest is taken into consideration and who stands to benefit or is burdened by the policy design. Because many of the barriers that you suggest are still present across states. There's a lot of variation across states, of course. But these issues persist despite the effort at recreational legalization. And so there ends up being a contradiction between the interest of those exercising power and the real interest of those they exclude. And I would argue that far from just being allowed to possess marijuana, that individuals who have a marijuana-related offense probably want that criminal record cleared a little more than they want the possession, right? Yet, expungement efforts have largely lagged behind in these efforts, right? Reformers assume that simply lifting marijuana prohibition would transform racially disparate policing, which fundamentally misunderstands the racial history of this country, right? That we know that disparities in carceral contact happen again at almost every touch point, largely at the discretion of street-level bureaucrats, including police officers, prosecutors, and judges. So simple lifting of prohibition was not sufficient. Now, what I'm really concerned about is something entirely different, not entirely different, but something related, but not necessarily on the technical merits, what we call policy feedback, specifically policy feedback after recreational marijuana legalization. Policy feedback is simply what people learn about their interaction with policy. We often think about politics having an effect on policy, but you can imagine the reverse situation where someone's interaction with the state actually can fundamentally transform the way they engage in politics. Now, I like to say in my classes, when we talk about politics, we have to think broader than just voting. That's not the only thing that is included in political behavior. You can think about policy participation as well as being another form of political behavior. And essentially, people are learning when they interact with these different policies, right? Or we call interpretive effects. Policy may influence their views of their own standing in society, depending on government responsiveness to themselves or people like them. These are cognitive or learning effects, and they refer to the ability of public policies to shape norms, values, and attitudes. All right, so here we can think about marijuana legalization, shaping the norms, values, and attitudes of individuals who were formerly incarcerated for a marijuana-related offense. Because policy imparts messages, and people are learning from their interaction. Policy teaches lessons about the type of the type of groups people belong to, what they deserve from their government, and what is expected of them. Now, Jamila Michener has some great work on racialized policy feedback, and there's good reason to expect that there are reasons that race might be important in these racialized effects. And she offers two dimensions for thinking about how race is germane in this context. The first is disproportionality, and the second is decentralization. So essentially, race is going to be important, it's going to impart important feedback effects if these two conditions are present. So conditions of disproportionality and decentralization are crucial indicators that race is an imperative part of policy feedback. So let's thread it through marijuana legalization. First, you have decentralization, right? We can essentially think about these as police officers who have a great deal of discretion when they're interacting with the public. So these citizen-state interactions are largely at the whim of police officers. All right, so these street-level bureaucrats decide who to arrest and what ways they're going to intervene. Right, so police officers have a great deal of discretion, which some would argue has contributed to this notion of disproportionality. Right. So decentralization, that's police discretion. The other is disproportionality. We know, for example, that Black people in Michigan are 3.6 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana possession. That's an example of disproportionality. Where I live in Pennsylvania, that number is 3 times more likely. So we know that there's a good chance, or based on this theoretical position, that this policy feedback might be racialized. Now, why does that matter? What does that have to do with expungement? What does that have to do with marijuana? And I think this picture captures it well. This is a political cartoon by Mark Murphy. And I want you to think about for a moment, what is recreational legal marijuana or expungement teaching that person in this picture? And what is the policy feedback? First, what is the picture depicting? What is your read of the picture? What do you think it's depicting? So a lot of irony. Those tally marks are probably the days that person has been incarcerated for that particular crime. And now they're reading in the front page of a newspaper that marijuana is okay now. So the thing that has turned their life upside down is now legally permissible by the state that once punished them for the same conduct, now is commercial. And I want you to also note that a good number of weed dispensaries look like they look like Apple stores now, right? And so that the word irony is perfect here. Because individuals are interacting with this particular policy, which is legalization, and we're wondering, what are they actually learning? right? What is the policy feedback effect of seeing marijuana legalization take place in real time while you're still suffering the collateral consequences of prohibition? Right? There are people still in prison for marijuana today, right? So whatever they learn, there's good reason to believe that this will affect their participation in petition-based expungement. Partly because we know that individuals who have criminal records are often categorized in unfavorable terms or viewed as deviant, right? And which means that they receive very different messaging than the rest of the population. And as a result, these people often fail to claim government benefits for which they are eligible. That's expungement. Those, this is work from Weaver and Lerman, those with contact at every level of criminal supervision withdraw from political life. They are less likely to participate in civic groups. They are less likely to express their political voice in elections, and they are less trusting of government. So, on balance, this particular position affects their participation in a variety of political and policy programs, including things like expungement. Right? So, one of the things that I'm starting to think about is the way in which these particular feedback effects might look like political alienation writ large, or legal estrangement, where people are completely withdrawing from the system, not just political life, which people typically think about as voting, but they don't participate at all, right? Because petition-based expungement, for example, requires that you interact with the state. In many places, you have to go to the courthouse. Or you have to navigate the internet, which is quite difficult to do to find out if you are actually eligible for that kind of relief. So instead, people throw their hands up and say, I'm not going to do that. Right? So again, think 6.5% of those eligible in Michigan actually petitioned to have their expungement cleared. Now, what these things have in common, both expungement as well as recreational marijuana legalization, is that, in my view, they're both representative of a policy design failure. And part of that is that the intervention did not do a great job in thinking about cultural competence as related to these particular issues. And I'm going to try to illustrate this by walking you through some of the challenges related to criminal record expungement. And the first thing that I would argue is that the delivery characteristics of that particular intervention are mismatched with the population that they are intended to serve. Specifically, petition-based expungement creates a great deal of administrative burden for individuals who would otherwise benefit from it. Administrative burden is simply thinking about one's experience with policy implementation as onerous, right? It's stressful, it's problematic. Administrative burden is quite present in other public programs as well, other welfare benefits, food stamps, Medicare. If anyone signed up for student loan relief, did anyone do that? The reason that application is so short and easy is that they're attempting to reduce the administrative burden associated with it, right? So that's a good example of a successful reduction of administrative burden. But that's not the case for something like criminal record expungement, right? Administrative burden shows up in three different ways: learning costs, psychological costs, and compliance costs. The learning costs are actually learning whether or not you're actually eligible for the program. Depending on the state that you live in, there might be waiting periods. Certain crimes may be ineligible for expungement. You have to learn how to access the service. There was a study out of Philadelphia in the drug courts. Participants who completed the drug court successfully had their records automatically expunged. But when you asked them to describe or explain the process, very few of them could actually tell you what an expungement was. So they didn't really understand. So there are high barriers in terms of learning. The second is the psychological cost. And those are the policy feedbacks that I just mentioned. We know that individuals who have criminal records want to reduce the stigma associated with that record. So typically economists think about stigma as being one of the reasons people don't apply for things like food stamps, right? But in the case of a criminal record, these individuals are actually motivated to remove the stigma that has been imposed on them by the state. So stigma explanation doesn't really make a lot of sense here. Avoidance of the system, however, does end up being a primary psychological cost that they have to overcome. Distrust. We know that there are racial differences in how people think about the criminal legal system. African Americans far more distrustful than their white counterparts. And the third are the compliance costs. Those are all the things that you have to do to satisfy a petition or an application for relief, which can be quite burdensome. So just going through each of them specifically, expungements are low in visibility because they target a small isolated constituency. Few participants could define expungement, for example, and almost none could explain the process. And eligibility varies by offense type, waiting periods, and how to do it. I, with a group of students, tried to navigate the websites of all the states to try to get information about the expungement process. And let me tell you, that was very difficult for all of us. So imagine someone who is less literate on the computer having to navigate that same process. I talked about the psychological cost, system avoidance, legal cynicism, mistrust can also prove to be barriers for take-up of criminal record expungement. And as it relates to compliance costs, the things that the state requires in order for you to satisfy your petition are numerous. In many states, you actually have to file an application fee. In many states, you also have to get fingerprinted. In several states, you also have to include a background check. And in almost all states, you have to satisfy any fines or fees related to your carceral content. Child support, any kind of court administrative fees, which can add up quite a bit. Some places actually charge you for your term of incarceration, right? All of those things have to be satisfied before you can actually move through the petition process. And in some places, the local prosecutor who prosecuted you also has to approve and accept that this expungement is appropriate. Now, this is important, at least the compliance part. When you think about the archetype or the characteristics of someone who might require a criminal record, what do you think their class background is? By and large. Are they rich? Are they low income? Experiencing poverty? What do you think? Low income, okay? They tend to be low income. Now, the reason that I say that the criminal record expungement is mismatched is that we know that individuals who have criminal records are more likely to experience a loss of earnings across their life. So essentially, the state is asking, they're extracting money in order for you to satisfy this process that's going to allow you to get a better job. They're asking for money from individuals who often don't have, right? So when you think about cultural competence, when you think about race equity and policy design, when you think about the instruments, the compliance costs are totally out of whack with the characteristics or the characters of the typical characteristics of someone who has a criminal record and who would benefit from relief. Appel and Powell show that justice-involved persons often earn lower hourly wages and work fewer hours than their peers without a record. Some work out of Brennan, average earning loss depend on the level of carceral contact. Individuals who have been in prison can lose about half their lifetime earnings. And we also know that the average citizen, which justice-involved persons are not, 4 out of 10 adults have difficulty covering a $400 emergency, and that's according to the Federal Reserve. So if the average American has a challenge meeting a $400 emergency, what kind of expectations can we have for someone who has a criminal record and for whom that criminal record makes it more difficult for them to find gainful employment, right? So these application fees, you got documentations, you got court debt. None of that includes a lawyer that you might want to have representing you. It also depends on how complicated your criminal file is. And so when we think about, these are all the states that have filing fees broken down by the levels, and some of these states are outdated. As more states are moving toward clean slate, they're removing some of these administrative burdens, yet they persist. Now, again, as I said, states and counties are extracting monies, right? And those monies are actually going back into their administrative coffers. This is data from Illinois between 2017 and 2019, the amount of fees received and deposited. So about 718,000 in 2017, 600,000 in 2018, and 600,000 in 2019, all of which went back to the state police, right? Here, we were trying to devise a scheme to determine the burden, the level of burden that exists across states. This is a work in progress. But generally, how burdensome is this particular process in getting someone to go through the criminal record expungement process? Now, there are some positive outcomes and developments as relates to criminal record expungement and marijuana offenses. California probably has been the most progressive on this effort. They have partnered with Code for America to actually identify individuals who are eligible to have their records expunged. And I think a year and a half or 2 years ago, we're able to expunge about 60,000 people who had previous criminal record offenses. So there are ways to do this. Now, there's some evidence that suggests that even that is not without its problems. For example, there's some work out of Berkeley that suggests that even the automatic expungements can miss out on individuals who do not qualify because of the cutoffs of the types of records that are made eligible. So changes should be made to include a greater swath of people who are more likely African Americans have a different types of crimes that they've been convicted or arrested for. All of that to say is that we have to think more critically and more carefully about the instrumentations that we use to achieve these racially equitable outcomes. And I think that marijuana legalization provides a fruitful space to do that because the policy window is still open. But we have to be very mindful and attentive to the way that race functions or structures the way that people experience the administrative state. Because we'll have a generation of people who've been burdened with a criminal record, and these policy feedbacks will make them further withdraw from the system. And not just political systems, but social systems, programs that would otherwise benefit from them. And so when I talk about interdependence, that's what I mean. It doesn't just show up in one place, it shows up in multiple places. And so there are unintended consequences from things like marijuana legalization if we don't take a better account of how African American men specifically, because they're most burdened by prohibition, are experiencing reform. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Crawford.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciated it. And I'm thinking about the connections to other lectures that we had in the series, particularly this kind of lesson that policy, there's a feedback that then kind of needs to be thought about. We learned earlier in the semester about how municipal debt is a kind of wealth extraction device in some contexts. So I think about, well, what are the policy feedbacks that people who are experiencing that kind of wealth extraction facing? So that's what I'm thinking about. But I imagine that the rest of you are thinking about a lot of other things. So I'm excited for the kind of questions and comments that you all have.
This might be a silly question, but how do you get arrested for marijuana possession in a state where it's legal?
That's a great question. So there are, I think, a lot of, it's not entirely clear. There are a few explanations. So one of the things that there's mixed findings related to this question. One is that sometimes the arrests are distinguished by adults and youth. So youth are not, they can't possess, right? It's illegal for them to possess. There are other places where you can't be in possession, schools and things like that. But police officers, again, have a great deal of discretion. And so it could be one thing that leads to another that ends up being the thing that they end up being arrested for. But that's a great question. It's not a silly question. I think it's one that people are really trying to figure out how that keeps happening. Now, it's not clear. So they're just arrested. It's not clear that they go through the whole of the criminal process. It could just be a pickup and a release. But I think the primary explanation now is that there's a distinction between youth and adults. And so arrests have largely dropped for Black adults, but for youth, it has actually gone up. But there's some mixed findings as relates to that. Does that answer your question? I had a reviewer ask me the same question, and I was like, that's a great one.
To add to that as well, a lot of times people get charged with intent to sell. So the rules for intent to sell are really kind of vague. If you have some marijuana that's bagged up, then they might see that, and that's intent to sell in their eyes. If you're not a licensed seller of marijuana and you have, a certain amount, they still arrest you for that, even though it's, technically legal. I got pulled over, and then, like you said, a lot of times it's just a probable cause reason. So you know, I got pulled over and they said, I wasn't even high. They said, your car smells like marijuana. I work at a dispensary, you know? I don't know why it smells like marijuana. Well, get out the car. Then I got handcuffed and now they're searching my whole car. You know what I'm saying? So who knows if I would have had something, you know, in there, then that would have led to an arrest for something else. I think you brought up a really good point about expungement, and it just seems insane that, you know, because to repeal marijuana prohibition is like an admission of guilt and an admission of wrongdoing. So why would people have to file a petition in order to get something, you know, removed from their record that they should have never been criminalized for in the first place? You know?
Yep.
And like you said, the administrative fees, I think, and the money from that is a really big motive. It's almost like taking money out of the hands of the people that are the poorest and that we've wronged the most, you know? So what would be the best way to implement that in policy to whereas, you know, a universal policy or something that just says, you know, this is something that should have never been criminalized. If this is what's on your record, I guess Joe Biden talked about it a little bit, saying he wanted to, you know, pardon, see where that goes, you know, but how do we really do that in policy to whereas if you have, you know, something that obviously should be expunged, you don't have to file a petition. You don't have to jump through any hoops. It's just an admission of guilt or an admission of wrongdoing on the state's part or the federal government's part, and it's just removed.
So marijuana legalization is complicated because it is still a Schedule 1 narcotic, right? President Biden's trying to deal with that. And I think to his credit and Congress, despite their many flaws, when you look at the MORE Act, it actually does a pretty good job at it trying to address all of the things that we talked about. It makes a very clear admission. So it's not just legalization. The actual law makes marijuana legal, and it also provides for automatic expungement. And so it does provide that space to do that. President Biden's executive order in October, a few weeks ago, was a first important step at signaling to states that it would also be appropriate or okay for them to do the same thing. And so I think the model of the MORE Act is actually a very useful template for thinking about it. It might have been hard to follow me in this presentation, but the MORE Act is actually putting these two things together, which I think they should be. Many states pass legalization through ballot. Some pass it through state legislation, but very few states actually included expungement in the first part of the provisions in legalization. I think that was a mistake. So I think the MORE Act and what President Biden has done, and some have argued that it's not enough, but many people are actually incarcerated at the state level. So the state has to act. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that there's going to be a policy diffusion. There's learning. So policy, marijuana legalization has not been rolled out equally across states. Several states have failed in a few different ways, and they're trying to learn from other states. And so we're actually seeing that states are learning how to better do it. But again, I think that the MORE Act provides a good template for how to address the things that you are suggesting at the state level.
So we have a question from the online audience. It's from Edwin Juarez. Does your research include the cannabis social equity programs? Are these programs acting towards bridging the equity gap, or are they a check-the-box policy? I think you addressed this a little bit.
Yeah. So my research is not so much about the equity provisions, in part because I think in my view, I think they are a bit of a box to check. I think the research so far, and there hasn't been a great deal of it, not in just the research, but the anecdotal evidence as well, is that the social equity provisions have not worked the way that states had intended to. So Illinois had a lottery system. Part of the reason that it's in court is because there were no black lottery winners for dispensary licenses in the beginning. I showed you the clip of New Jersey being accused of not having any black licensees as well. And so I do think that is something that can be built out. It's very promising, but it's yet to materialize in a fruitful way.
Thank you. You touched on this just a few questions ago, just saying that like in states where marijuana has been legalized, that the main people who have been victimized as are youth. I guess I'm just sort of, I know it's not like your area of research, but just like the relationship that this has to like exacerbating like the school to prison pipeline.
What was the last part?
Just like the relationship that like marijuana arrests have had with like exacerbating the school to prison pipeline and the consequences that come with like the collateral arrest as a youth.
So it's a great question, and I'm gonna pivot a little bit. Carceral contact among youth actually has a negative socializing effect for them, right? And so if you're young and you have an unpleasant or any interaction with the police, that also has policy feedback, which can facilitate some of the same concerns for the school to prison pipeline. That you are starting them at a young age with these interactions. These interactions may be exacerbated by other things, but it also reduces their social, social and emotional well-being. Is also, they also experience declines in their social and emotional well-being when they have these interactions as well. I couldn't get that out. I apologize.
So you talked a bit about how public opinion data is limited among African Americans surrounding legalization. And we've also talked about how part of the disparity in like dispensary licenses or the amount that people are benefiting from legalized cannabis, there's a racial disparity there. And we've talked about how part of that is like the startup costs and that like these communities often lack the wealth to like begin these new businesses. But do you think that part of it has to do with like a cultural aversion to something that has been criminalized in among these communities for so long to like
Aversion for whom?
Aversion among like African Americans, part of like the lower uptake or lower benefit from legalized marijuana programs, is that do you think because at least in part of like a history of that being punished and criminalized and like disproportionately?
What was the last part? So does that have an effect on their pursuit of what?
Their pursuit of obtaining licenses or participating in dispensaries or legalized business?
I think it plays a part. I think it's also important to note that not everyone who has had a past conviction or arrest for marijuana wants to become a legal weed entrepreneur either. And I was also very careful to make a distinction between possession and selling, because I think that's a little murkier. But there are also startup costs. We know that there are racial disparities in lending as well. So the capital and startup ends up being very difficult, and I think there are a lot of learning costs associated with entering that particular space. And I do think that, again, there is policy feedback. So everything you just described, that is an interpretive effect. I don't trust the system to allow me to do this after they told me for the last 30 years that I can't do it. In fact, I've gotten in trouble. And so I think it creates a bit of a dynamic where people are not sure what they can actually rely on and whether something's worth the trouble. It's a lot, right? And it's also a heavy financial endeavor. And so it'll be interesting to see over time. Right now, the legal marijuana industry is overwhelmingly white. I think it's about 87% white. And so I think what's to be seen and what I would like to know is that, well, what happens when the person who has a past arrest or conviction sees that? What's the response to that? How are they thinking about that? And I think that is probably going to have a larger effect than misgivings about whether or not the state will allow them to open up a dispensary.
So I'm kind of going back to the second chance of hiring.
Mhm.
I want to know what your thoughts are, because I hear a lot of punitive, like, oh, well, they have a felon. And sometimes it's easy to kind of say, okay, they did, substance abuse, we can overlook that, but not fraud. How do you think we should navigate if we're ever in a hiring committee or a hiring management role? How should we navigate that without overjudging someone's
Sure.
past?
I'm going to offer an answer that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, which is that we're all criminals. And so that's that. We're all criminals. But I think there's a different question to ask. What are our expectations for someone who's served out the penalty imposed by the state? There's the second side of that. If people don't have gainful employment, they don't have reliable housing, they're not able to obtain an education, what do you think they're going to do in the absence of those opportunities to benefit themselves, right? We know that crime is related to poverty. And so by denying someone the opportunity to work, they want to work, what we're doing is pushing them back into a cycle of poverty and potentially recidivism. And so I think that's the greater cost than allowing. And the other part is, the other piece of this is, when we think about crime, one, crime is very racialized, but we also have this image in our mind that all crime is violent. In fact, that many of the people in these situations are not violent criminals. They're caught up on drug charges of some variety. And so whether or not that actually presents a real risk, and there are arguments to be made that certain people shouldn't be working in certain places. I think that's a legitimate one. But the one that tends to consume us psychologically does not cohere with the reality on the ground, right? These are not individuals who pose enduring risks. They did something, they were punished for it. Why should they continue to be punished for it? I think is the question I end with. Did that answer your question?
Any other questions? Just want to make sure we get ones from people who haven't asked yet, but yours have been great, so happy to take another one.
So I know I've been asking a lot of questions.
All good.
I thought you brought up a really good point about the tax revenue. And like you said, once they start making so much money from it in tax revenue, there's really no incentive for social equity.
Mhm.
I really wanted to be federally legalized. You know, I have a friend that's a probation agent, and you know, the testing is one of the biggest discriminatory things too, you know, especially in hiring. You know, even if you were convicted of, you know, say suspended license, now you're on probation, now you're getting tested for marijuana, and that's another reason that's going to
This is gonna
keep
be a whole set of
now
problems.
you go back to jail, but it doesn't show up as marijuana or you violated probation.
Yep.
But really you shouldn't be being tested for marijuana, you know, anyway. I'm honestly a little nervous though. I think, you know, in Detroit we've been a little successful with social equity just because the federal government hasn't got involved yet. But honestly, I think once and there's no banking, you know, we have to go to dark bank. You can't get banking in cannabis still from a, you know, traditional banking institution. So once you allow these multi-state operators to, you know, have chain dispensaries, and you allow the big guys to really come in, they could do banking, then it's probably going to be even less representation of, you know, people of color and equity applicants. So how do we make sure that, you know, as it goes federally legal, that we do find a way to still incentivize social equity, for the government to incentivize social equity once the big guys get in, once they really start bringing in the tax revenue? What's the
That's
incentive?
actually a very good question. It's the reason I came back to this slide. If you are, and this is a real world poverty solutions seminar, and so I think that we have to think seriously about what that involves. One, what are the policy goals that we're actually trying to achieve? Not everyone wants to be a commercial entrepreneur in marijuana, but that's been the focus because that's where the money is, right? That's narrow-sighted, and it creates a different set of challenges that don't really deal with the collateral consequences associated with people on the ground, right? So I think having a clear set of I think the social equity provisions, ones that I've seen so far, have been about building industry. And I've already pointed out that, you know, that's part of the reason that vice ends up being allowed in this context, because it provides for that. But that's not the only goal. And so this was part of the argument in the first paper, is that that's the interest, I think, of white entrepreneurs. That was not the interest of African Americans in this context necessarily, right? And so being very clear about what the policy objectives are to achieve race equity is essential. And it can't just focus on commerce. It has to focus on the whole of how people are experiencing the administrative state. So it's not just whether they're going to become a marijuana, it's whether or not they have to submit to a drug test, right? So one of the things that someone said on Twitter when President Biden announced his executive order, someone who I guess used to work at the White House said, "Does that mean I get my job back now?" Right? But those are real issues. And those are real issues that are going to come up outside of the commercial aspects of it. And so when we think about race equity, when we think about policy design and implementation, you've got to think about the whole process. It's not just one phase. There's a whole process that we really have to think through. And race equity has to be essential. It's when we take a race equity lens, it's a set of questions that we ask ourselves throughout the policy process, not just one time. And I think race equity is important here. It's different than diversity. I think diversity means everything and nothing. But equity is actually a useful term because I like to think about it glasses and braces problem. If you have two children, one needs glasses and one needs braces, you don't get them both glasses because one got one. You get them what they need in order for them to be healthy, right? And so race equity, I think, should be trying to do that at every level of the policy process.
Probably close to a time, but I'm going to end with one question because I think one of the things that's always interesting when we take a race equity lens is that it does provide opportunity for people who aren't Black to also think about the question. So I'm interested in what you think of this framing, and you're welcome to tell me, Trevor, that's racist. But one of the things that I've noticed living in Ann Arbor, where there are a lot of dispensaries, is that every time a new business pops up that I'm like, oh, I'm going to like that. That's a cool coffee shop. It's a new dispensary. These are targeted at me, targeted at an old white man who wants to buy coffee. But they fit into the kind of this terrain. So if you kind of experience that kind of positive kind of like, oh, this is for me now, I think that also is a kind of psychological feedback that is different than the psychological feedback you've been talking about for most of this talk. Does that? And I think it gives an entree for white people into thinking about this. Oh, I'm targeted in a different way by this. So other people's experience of this is going to be very different.
I do think that's important. And I think that it's part of what facilitated legalization was a recognition among white Americans that this is something that one, they could indulge in, but two, also recognizing the disparities in what was happening as they became consumers or whatever. So I think it's an entry point for people to recognize that policy and laws are not objective or neutral. They are very racialized. And I think this is a very clear instance of it. And so I think recreational marijuana legalization was promising because I think a lot of advocates and reformers recognized that the war on drugs was racist. And that it did considerable damage to Black communities, considerable damage to Black communities. And many ran with that as the banner to advocate for reform. And then it happened and the moneyed interest kind of took over. So I think that it's the reason that I don't pay attention so much to the social equity provisions, but really thinking about how does this continue to affect African Americans in an adverse way and keeping the race equity frame central to the conversation so that people remember that the drug war was racist and did considerable harm to the Black community, which can be replicated again if we're not careful. And I think that's the takeaway. Thank Dr. Crawford for the excellent presentation. Thank you all so much.